Well, good evening, and welcome to the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies here at Elizabethtown College. So glad each of you could join us here this evening, here in person at the Bucher Meetinghouse on campus, as well as those joining us live stream from across the country, for our annual Kreider Fellow Lecture, presented this evening by Jonathan Steyer, this year's Kreider Fellow. And I'll introduce Jonathan in a moment, but first would like to acknowledge Dr. Ken and Carol Kreider, who are here with us this evening, for endowing the Kreider Fellowship, which annually brings scholars here to the Young Center to deepen and further our understanding of Anabaptism and Pietism and the traditions and groups that grow out of them. This evening, we look at the experience and identity of the Brethren in Christ, a church drawing on Anabaptist and Pietist and Wesleyan traditions, and earlier known as the River Brethren because of their origin locally here along the Susquehanna River. How and why the group's name changed from River Brethren to Brethren in Christ takes us down several historical paths, including that of the American Civil War, conscription records, and the experience of Peace Church members in that 19th century conflict. And our guide on that journey this evening is Jonathan Steyer. Steyer is a researcher, archivist, and historian who worked at the Pennsylvania State Archives for 35 years, retiring in 2019 as supervisor of reference services for the state archives. He is also the vice president of the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society and serves on the boards of the York County History Center and the Friends of Camp Security. Those of you who aren't familiar with that, a site Camp Security is an American Revolutionary encampment and actually I believe military prison from the American Revolution that's in York County. Steyer serves as a volunteer both at the State Archives and at the York County History Center. I want to let our live stream audience know that they can submit questions at any time via the Q&A feature of Zoom, and as time permits, we'll take up those questions along with questions from our audience here in the Meetinghouse as we can. So now the unknown story, soon to be known to all of us, but still unknown story of the naming of the Brethren in Christ. The 2022 Kreider Fellow, Jonathan Steyer. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Steve, for that kind and generous introduction, and I want to thank the Kreiders for endowing this fellowship and making it possible for me to have this enriching experience. I was delighted when I was offered the fellowship because I'm not an academic scholar, nor do I have the credentials that many of the past fellows have arrived with. I've appreciated the opportunity to focus on my project and to receive some funding to travel to records repositories. And also I have enjoyed using Elizabethtown College's fine library, which has an outstanding collection of books and sources on the historic peace churches. I'd like to thank the Young Center staff, including Steve Nolt, Kay Wolf, wherever Kay is. Kay takes very good care of me. And Edsel Burge, and also Jeff Bach has been welcoming as well. They support and encourage me and offer valuable suggestions for research. I'd also like to take this opportunity actually to push one of Steve's books, Mennonites, Amish, and the American Civil War. This is the best book on the topic, and I've been rereading it. I'm still impressed by how good it is. It's for sale out in the lobby, and if he runs out, I'm sure they can get more. Or the Clay Bookstore down Route 322 has a whole stock of them as well. I will be referring to it this evening because it has been so valuable in my research. I also want to thank all my family and friends and colleagues who are attending in person or online. And finally, where are they? The archivists of the Brethren in Christ Church, Devin Manzul Thomas and Glenn Pierce. They have been patient, in fact, more than patient, with my request for records and copies. In fact, just yesterday, Glenn sent me something that I'm going to be showing you this evening. Relentless in digging out obscure things for me and informative about Brethren in Christ history and polity. This evening, I would like to talk about how the Brethren in Christ denomination, formerly known as the River Brethren, as Steve said, allegedly adopted its name during the American Civil War in response to the Union draft. Now, before I begin, I have a few confessions to make. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the Brethren in Christ Church. I did receive my undergraduate degree from Messiah College, and I attended the church on campus for a period while I was a student, but I have no other connection to the church. So if you have questions about Brethren in Christ history, I'm not the person to ask. You want to ask these two gentlemen back here. Also, although my topic pertains to the Civil War, I am not a Civil War scholar or expert. I might know a little bit more about the Civil War draft than most folks. However, I'm by no means an expert in any respect. So the question arises, how did I become interested in the naming of the Brethren in Christ, and why did I embark on this research endeavor? Well, I'm the son of George Edward Stayer, who was the son of Arthur Vernon Stayer, the son of Edward Hartman Stayer, the son of David Brollier Stayer, who was the son of Adam Stayer of South Woodbury Township, Bedford County, who was a Civil War conscientious objector. Shortly after I started working at the Pennsylvania State Archives in 1985, I learned about this file of conscientious objector depositions. My curiosity was piqued because I knew that my Stayer family had been members of the Church of the Brethren for many generations. In fact, all the generations that you saw on the screen spent at least part of their time in the church. I checked this file, and sure enough, there was a deposition of my third great-grandfather, Adam Stayer, as well as those of all his brothers. I was curious as to what his Civil War experience was like, so I started to do some research. And this is before Steve's book was published, so I quickly learned that little had been written on the topic, particularly for families of Brethren background. So I decided that I was going to hunt down every reference that I could find to Civil War conscientious objectors in Pennsylvania, since all of my ancestors of that period lived in our fair Commonwealth. Now, having been a student at Messiah College, I was familiar with the peace history of the Brethren in Christ. One of my professors had been Carlton Whitlinger, who had recently published the definitive history of the denomination in 1978. So I thought I would see what he had to say on the subject of the Brethren in Christ and the Civil War. And this is what he wrote. After the society in the United States accepted the River Brethren name, it was used until the Civil War. The military draft instituted by the Union government then created the necessity for the Brethren to register in Washington as a non-resistant organization. After counseling about the matter, they decided to register as Brethren in Christ. The sources are silent about the reasons why they chose to substitute this name for the familiar River Brethren. Well, by the time I had read this, I'd done some research, and I was puzzled by his statement that the Brethren had to register in Washington, for nothing I had consulted to that point ever suggested that such a registration was necessary. And later on, we will see that his choice of words was unfortunate. Like a good researcher, I referred to his footnotes, and as you can see, he cites only two sources, which we will consider later. He did admit, however, you can see the last sentence there, researchers have been unable to find any trace of that registration in the records of the federal government. Although I was not able to verify as such at the Brethren in Christ archives at Messiah University, I suspect that Whitlinger heavily relied on the previous research of church historian Martin Schrag for his information about the denominational name change. In an article that he published in the inaugural issue of Brethren in Christ History and Life, Schrag had this to say about the documentation of the name change story. Several Brethren in Christ scholars have looked in Washington, D.C. for a communication sent by the River Brethren to the United States government during the American Civil War. According to a 1904 account, it was necessary for the River Brethren to go on record as a non-resistant religious organization. The Brethren did so, and at the same time decided to register the church as the Brethren in Christ. The document recording this transaction has not been found. In a 1990 letter to me, he provided more detail about the frustration of his research efforts. I do not remember what records I checked in the National Archives. I simply told them what I was interested in and looked at the material they gave me. I was not pleased with the material I looked through. I was not on the right trail as I found little material relating to peace churches and the CO stand. I could accept that the BICs, now Brethren in Christ use BIC as abbreviation, okay? Not a pen for the Brethren in Christ. May not have done much by way of writing, etc., but when I saw a little by the Friends, Mennonites, and German Baptist Brethren, I knew I was in the wrong load. After about 2 days at it, I went to the Library of Congress. I looked only at the Thaddeus Stevens collection. In my dissertation, I state on page 111 that intense efforts were made to find materials in DC dealing with the BIC registering during the Civil War. I love this next sentence. That is an overstatement that may say something about my sanctification. Tell it not to Gath. So I had to look up what tell it not to Gath, where tell it not to Gath came from, and actually it's found twice in the Bible, once in 2 Samuel and once in Micah. In 2 Samuel, David is lamenting the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, and in Micah, the prophet's warning of the impending judgment on the divided nation of Israel. And in both cases, they don't want their Philistine enemies to know about the misfortunes of the Israelite nation. Just an aside here, this is very typical of the way Martin Schrag used to talk. He always had these little choice things he would throw out now and then. Later in the 1990s, when both Schrag and I were working with Beverly Wilson Palmer to collect the writings of Thaddeus Stevens for a microfilm edition of his works, Schrag wrote the following to editor Palmer. In the process of registration, the group, being the Brethren in Christ, identified themselves as the Brethren in Christ. The focus of my attention is that the papers, letters, etc. of the registration have not been found. To a historian working in Brethren in Christ sources, those papers are seen as a pearl of great price. So what I'm searching for is the pearl of great price. Unfortunately, as of this date, I still have not found it. But as Kyle Weaver recently wrote in the Pennsylvania Heritage, how reliable is the available evidence in providing greater truth about stories that have come down to us? And so that's basically what I'm trying to do, is to find out what is the true story of how this name changed. Oops. Now, Steve stole a lot of my thunder about the Brethren in Christ background, so I'm not going to say too much about them, except that the Brethren in Christ started as the River Brethren down near the Susquehanna River outside of Bainbridge. In fact, this historical marker stands along the Sagertown Road, not too far west from here. Shortly before the Civil War, probably in the 1850s, the River Brethren split into three different groups. The more conservatives were called the Old Order River Brethren, also known as Yorkers, because the majority of their group was in York County. And then the United Zion Church, United Zion's Children, or they were also called Brinzerites because their initial founder, Matthias Brinzer, wanted to construct a meeting house outside of Middletown, contrary to the decision of the River Brethren against building meeting houses at that time. But the group that we're going to be focusing on is the larger segment, sort of the moderate, you might call, which maintained the name River Brethren until the latter part of the 19th century, as we will see. When Steve was writing his book, he contacted Morris Sider at Messiah College and asked how many River Brethren were around at the time of the Civil War, and Morris replied that probably all three groups together amounted to about 2,000 people. So this is not a large denomination. It's still not a large denomination today. Throughout the 19th century, common distinctives of the River Brethren were trine baptism by immersion following a conversion experience, love feasts with meal and feet washing accompanying the practice of communion, nonconformity or plain dress, and non-resistance or refusal of military service. In appearance and practice, they were very similar to the antecedents of the Church of the Brethren, who were called German Baptist Brethren, or more commonly Dunkards at that time. There was much confusion of the two groups, and I found a very interesting quote. One 19th century observer said he saw no difference between the German Baptist Brethren and the River Brethren, except that the River Brethren required that somebody absolutely had to have a conversion experience before they would be baptized. And the German Baptist Brethren kind of saw baptism as the conclusion of the conversion experience, or sort of leading towards baptismal regeneration. Of course, there were many theological and practical differences that this commentator overlooked. Now, the River Brethren have been known by various names throughout their history, probably most commonly River Brethren in the 19th century. They've also been called the New Brethren, as opposed to the German Baptist Brethren, who were the Old Brethren, because the German Baptist Brethren had started first. They've also been confused with the German Baptist Brethren as Dunkards or Dunkers. And so you can't always tell when you see the word Dunker whether they're talking about German Baptist Brethren or River Brethren. And of course, in the last 140 years or so, they've been known as the Brethren in Christ. Now, throughout this presentation, I will primarily use River Brethren and Brethren in Christ for the group that I'm discussing. If I simply say the word brethren, I'm talking about the same people, not the German Baptist brethren. If I do talk about the German Baptist brethren, I'll call them by that name or by Dunkers. I'll try to be clear about which group I'm speaking, but it does get confusing. Of course, this confusion appears in the records themselves. Here is an 1862 draft enrollment record from Lancaster County, and you'll see that the individual named there was Henry Ginder, and he was listed as a Dunker, but we know from the church's periodical that Henry Ginder was indeed a member of the Brethren in Christ for many years. So he was most likely a Brethren in Christ, or a River Brethren at the time of the Civil War. Having a brief understanding of the Brethren in Christ and their names, I now would like to talk about how the name Brethren in Christ came to be applied to the River Brethren. First, I want to look at 20th century versions of the name change story. Then I want to show how the transition from the name River Brethren to Brethren in Christ occurred over time. From there, we will consider aspects of the Civil War drafts that affect our understanding of the name change story and the records to be searched, and then I want to conclude with some considerations and questions for further research. The earliest version of the name change story that has been found to date appeared in the 1904 compilation and index of the General Conference Minutes of the Brethren in Christ Church. For those of you who are not aware, General Conference is the annual gathering of church leaders and members to discuss theological and practical matters of the church and to make decisions about such. This was what was written. During the Civil War of 1860 to 65, while the federal government of the United States took drastic measures to raise an army to cope with the rebellion, some of the members of the Brotherhood, having been drafted for service, who proclaimed their non-resistant faith, it became necessary for the Brotherhood to go on record with the national government at Washington as a non-resistant religious organization. And at a formal council held in the city of Lancaster, PA, it was decided to have the name of the Brotherhood recorded as a non-resistant religious organization as the Brethren in Christ. Hence the present name, the Brethren in Christ, formerly known as River Brethren. Now, just a few notes about this paragraph. First, the dates of the Civil War are incorrect because the war started in 1861, unless you count the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So that's what, and keep in mind, they're writing this 40 years after the war. So you're talking about people who are doing things from memory, most likely. Also note that according to this account, the name change occurred at a formal council held in the city of Lancaster. And reference was made to going on record with the federal government, not registering with it as many later people would say. Just keep these details in mind as we go along. Now, we would like to know who wrote this and what was their source of information. Well, the compilers' names are listed on the title page, as you can see over there. Henry K. Kreider, Eli M. Engel, and Samuel R. Smith. All of these men were leaders of the church and had the ability to write the history. However, only Engel and Smith were alive during the Civil War, but they were children at the time. Therefore, none of the compilers of this particular account had direct experience of the draft unless they had family members who were subject to it. Any one of these men could have written the text, and I believe that one of them certainly did. I don't think they necessarily copied it from somewhere else. And in the denominations periodical, the Evangelical Visitor, they ran these articles telling their readership about the status of this publication. And towards the end of an article in April 1905, Samuel R. Smith says, the work of compiling and arranging was an arduous one, and I'm safe to say that it took the combined labors of the committee nearly 1 month. So I'm assuming that they indeed, one of those three individuals did indeed write this account. Now, at first I suspected that Bishop Henry Kreider wrote the history, since he submitted other information along with this account for the 1916 Census of Religious Bodies. But following Eli Engel's death in 1949, Bishop E.J. Schwalm had this to say about him. His good taste and meticulous wording in the preparation of reports gave dignity and value to many prepared statements. His long and wide acquaintanceship with the church, as well as his familiarity with church literature and conference rulings, placed him in the truest sense a church father. These accolades suggest that Engel might have prepared the historical account because of his acquaintance with church matters and documents. However, none of the papers at the Brethren in Christ archives of any of these men indicate who wrote the 1904 history. But if I had to be a gambling person, I would say it was probably Eli Engel. Sometime in 1906 or 1907, the Census Bureau in Washington, D.C. solicited statistical, historical, and other data from religious groups throughout the country to prepare a census of religious bodies. Published in 1910, this census contains the following description of the name change story. During the Civil War, some of the members, although proclaiming the doctrine of non-resistance, were drafted for military service, and it became evident that the denomination must secure legal recognition as a religious organization holding that doctrine. Steps to secure such recognition were taken at a private council held in Lancaster, PA, as early as 1862, at which time those who remained after the separation of the other two branches who constituted the great majority of the brethren decided to adopt the name Brethren in Christ instead of River Brethren, which was done the following year. This exact same text, word for word, was copied into the later censuses of religious bodies, which was done every 10 years, 1916, 26, and 1936. And 1936 was the last time this particular type of census was published. Note that this account, the name change now occurred at a private council held in Lancaster, PA, which may be the city or it may have been the county. Remember that the 1904 version said it was at a formal council held sometime during the war. Now, that might just be a play on words, but I think it might have some significance. Also, in this account, the date of the council was given as early as 1862 rather than just sometime during the Civil War. This version places the name change a year after the meeting of the council, which of course raises other questions. If the council was held in 1862, did the name change in 1863? Or do we even know when the council was convened or exactly when the new name was adopted? Now there is a reference to the necessity of legal recognition rather than simply going on record with the federal government. While the 1904 and 1906 stories are similar, some minor but important differences are evident, as we have just seen. Again, the question arises, who wrote this paragraph and what was their source of information? According to the 1908 minutes of General Conference, a committee was appointed to prepare a response to the Census Bureau to assist the General Executive Secretary. The committee consisted of Michael B. Musser, Aaron H. Martin, and George Detweiler, who were going to assist, again, Samuel R. Smith, the General Executive Secretary. So who were these men? As in 1904, they were church leaders who were capable writers. This time, however, two of them had been a draft age and had lived in Pennsylvania during the Civil War. Aaron Martin and Michael Musser, as you can see there. Even more interestingly, Aaron Martin's name appears on the 1863 Lancaster County Draft Enrollment Records. Therefore, at least Aaron Martin, must have been very familiar with the church's situation and response during the war. While I have found no evidence to date that his drafting led to the Lancaster meeting of the Brethren, I believe that both he and Musser would have objected if the account prepared for the census of religious bodies did not align with their lived experience. Consequently, I place the greatest weight of truth on this version of the story. Even still, we still do not know who wrote it or if it's entirely accurate. But again, keep this version in mind as we go along. The next important permutation of the name change story appeared in Asa Climenhage's 1942 History of the Brethren in Christ Church. This was the first comprehensive book-length review of the denomination's history. Born in 1889 in Canada, Climenhage came to Pennsylvania in 1912 to check out the nascent Messiah College and remained in the area thereafter to teach and hold administrative posts at the institution. He received his first doctorate from Potomac University, Washington, D.C. in 1925 with an alleged dissertation entitled The Original History of the Brethren in Christ Church, which supposedly served as the basis for this book. In 1928, Congress investigated Potomac University as a diploma mill. Nothing new, right, with our pay for education today, or what do they call it? And it later disappeared from the educational landscape, making its records impossible to find. And maybe in the question and answer session, I could tell you a little bit of my fun trying to track down the records of so-called Potomac University. Kleiman Hage's dissertation has never been located, so we don't know if it included information and citations that he did not put in the book. Nevertheless, some of his research for the book can be found in the Brethren in Christ archives, including valuable lists of names and information about 19th century River Brethren leaders. And I think this is one of the most overlooked sources they have on the Brethren in the 19th century, because somebody made notations about, biographical notations about many of the bishops and ministers. Kleiman Hager wrote the following about the name change. During the Civil War of 1860 to 65 in the United States, it was necessary for the church to go on record at Washington as a non-resistant body. A council held in Lancaster City, Pennsylvania, decided to record the church in Washington as the Brethren in Christ, formerly known as River Brethren, and believing in non-resistance. The scriptural basis for being non-resistant was Matthew 5:44, and you can read the rest of the passages there. In later years, other scriptural statements were added, setting forth the same view. This account seems to have been taken from the 1904 version, but without footnotes. Also, it references scriptural support for the peace position, suggesting that he was copying from some extant document. Now, these references that you see here were used by the Brethren in other documents regarding their peace position throughout the latter part of the 19th century. However, this sentence is almost a direct quote from an item that was circulated by the Brethren during World War I to support their peace position, suggesting that this might have been Kleiman Hage's source. And if you compare this, which I'm not going to do right now, if you compare this with the previous thing, the way he listed the scriptural references in his book are in the exact same order as what you see here, with the exact same translations used. And as you can see, these passages are associated with the Civil War story, which is in the paragraph above. One person who was interviewed in 1991 about Kleiman Hage's life remarked that his church history was, quote, based on personal acquaintance and knowledge of the old days, but most observations are not documented, unquote. Indeed, in 1917 and 1918, he canvassed almost the entire denomination, seeking to raise funds to keep Messiah College in existence. And in an undated manuscript, he recalled that, quote, conversations with old and young were greatly enjoyed, unquote. His records of his journeys indicate that he visited Michael Musser, that Civil War guy, so he would have had an opportunity to hear the stories from the Civil War. Still, his text is so close to the 1904 General Conference Minutes Index that we can assume he relied on it for this paragraph rather than the stories that he may have heard. Curiously, at the end of his book, as an appendix, he includes a transcription of the version that appears in the 1916 Census of Religious Bodies, which was exactly the same as the one that had been prepared for the 1906 census. And of course, this differs a little bit from the one in a text of his book, which was taken from the 1904 conference minutes. At the December 1948 meeting of the Lancaster County Historical Society, local historian and genealogist Wilmer Eshelman read his paper on the River Brethren denominations. His account of the name change differs markedly from the ones we have just discussed. He wrote, the change of the name of River Brethren, termed by many as Dunkards, to Brethren in Christ came about at a convention held in Lancaster in 1861 as a result of the Civil War, when all religious denominations were compelled to register with the United States Department of War. Heretofore, they had little reason to choose a formal title or name, and the term River Brethren had stuck. Now it became necessary for the federal government to recognize the denomination to which Magdalena Engel had once referred as the Congregation of the Persuasion. The delegates to the Lancaster Convention in 1861 decided that since their church had assumed national proportions, it was hardly fitting to continue under the name River Brethren, and instead they chose the name of Brethren in Christ. Eshelman claimed that the Lancaster Council was held in 1861, that all religious denominations were required to register with the War Department, and that the River Brethren chose the name Brethren in Christ because their church had assumed national proportions. Now, Eshelman had quoted Kleiman Hage's book elsewhere in his article, but none of the statements that we see here was documented. In fact, the part about religious denominations registering with the government isn't even true. Eshelman was born in 1913, the son of a Reformed Mennonite minister, so he would not have had any firsthand knowledge of the River Brothers' Civil War history. He might have extrapolated his paragraph from the information in Climahage's book and possibly from conversations that he had with Brethren in Christ or Old Order River Brethren who did not have an accurate knowledge of the Civil War experience. Because elsewhere in his article, he seems to indicate that he was talking to some of these people. Eshelman's papers at the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, which is now called Mennonite Life, do not contain his research for this article. And the papers of Carlton Whitlinger, the Brethren in Christ historian that I mentioned earlier, at the Brethren in Christ archives include at least one letter in which Whitlinger identified other errors in Eshelman's essay. Therefore, I count this as the least reliable and most embellished version of the name change story. And just for my Brethren in Christ friends, it might interest you to know that in 1955, C.N. Hostetter Jr., who was president of Messiah College, submitted this account to the Department of Internal Affairs as the history of the Brethren rather than citing Climahage's book, which I still haven't figured that one out. Why he used somebody who was not a Brethren in Christ's account rather than his own churchman. In 1968, World War II conscientious objector and University of Toronto history professor Peter Brock published his monumental 1,000-page book, big doorstop of a book, entitled Pacifism in the United States. Despite their minuscule numbers, Brock included mention of the River Brethren in his massive work. And he says, the extreme congregationalism of the River Brethren posed a serious problem for the sect after the outbreak of war, for it led the federal authorities to express doubt about whether the Brethren in fact formed a religious denomination and whether, therefore, they were legally entitled to the exemption granted by law to members of non-resistant churches. In order to remove this difficulty, leaders of the Brethren came together in council at Lancaster, PA in 1862. After drawing up a statement of their belief in non-resistance for presentation in Washington, the delegates took steps to form a legally recognized church under the name Brethren in Christ. He identified his sources, as you can see down here, as Climahage's History of the Brethren in Christ and the 1936 Census of Religious Bodies, which reads exactly the same as the 1906 one. His interpretation of these sources, however, is troubling. He stated that the extreme congregationalism caused the federal government to express doubt about the legitimacy of the denomination, that the council was held in 1862. As we have seen, neither of his sources yields that information about the federal government, and in fact, no researcher to date who has examined the draft has found records of such. And those sources only placed the date of the council as early as 1862. He cited Melvin Gingrich's History of the Mennonites and Amish in Iowa for another example of congregations organizing as a church group to respond to the Civil War draft. However, my reading of Gingrich's text and of his sources leads me to a slightly different conclusion. The organization that Gingrich describes seems to have been more coincidental with the timing of the draft than in response to it, particularly since it occurred in 1861 prior to any Union draft. Furthermore, from my familiarity with the draft records, I know that Brock took liberties elsewhere in his book when interpreting sources. He seems to have relied heavily on secondary sources, and particularly those things he could access at the Friends Library at Swarthmore College, where he was doing some of this work. As far as I have been able to determine, he never visited the National Archives or the Pennsylvania State Archives in preparation for this work. So, like Wilmer Eshelman's article, I place little confidence in Brock's version of the name change story. Which brings us back to Carlton Whitlinger's book in 1978. Although published almost 45 years ago, it remains the most recent and best comprehensive history of the Brethren in Christ denomination. However, before we move on, I just want to point out the last sentence here where it says, the sources are silent about the reasons why they chose to substitute this name for the familiar River Brethren. I think that I have found some clues to that answer to that question, which we will see later. So now we've looked at the 20th century versions of this story. I want to consider a chronological review of the transition from River Brethren to Brethren in Christ. Prior to the Civil War and up through the 1860s, the denomination generally was designated the River Brethren with no reference to the name Brethren in Christ. Here's a very interesting article from the Reading Times noting that the River Brethren are similar to the Amish. And I could provide many examples from the newspapers of references to river brethren. Allegedly writing to Thaddeus Stevens in December of 1863, Isaac Tyson of Montgomery County said, "Let us consider the many thousands of those harmless, non-resisting people, such as Quakers, Mennonites, 4 different kinds of German Baptists, corruptly called Dunkers, river brethren, of which I am one." So if we only have the typescript that remains of this letter, I'm not sure what the punctuation is like in the original. If this is correct, he is saying that he was a river brethren person in 1863, so suggesting that the name had not changed by that time, certainly not in 1861 or 1862. In the spring of 1864, the Reading Times published data from the National Almanac and Annual Record of 1864, which identified the denomination as River Brethren. I was hoping I could find later versions of that almanac to see if they reported the name Brethren in Christ later on, but unfortunately I haven't been able to find them. Closer to home, here in Lancaster County, the Intelligencer Journal reported on River Brethren love feasts in this area, northwestern part of the county, in 1868. Note that the River Brethren were considered to be a subgroup of the German Baptist Brethren, which was something they always were trying to work against. And this was written 3 years after the close of the Civil War. So one would think that if the Brethren in Christ's name had been adopted by this time, it would have been reported in this article, particularly because this was copied from the Mount Joy Herald. And the Mount Joy Herald seemed to be the newspaper that was most likely to be familiar with River Brethren activities and report on them. Unfortunately, very few issues of the Mount Joy paper survived for this time period. I was hoping to look through the Mount Joy Herald for the Civil War period to see what they had said about the River Brethren, and I think the Lancaster County Historical Society only has one issue from the 1860s, and that's it. So if anybody knows where the Mount Joy Herald is being held, please let me know. As late as 1872, this is 7 years after the close of the war, the church apparently continued to use the River Brethren name exclusively. This booklet listing places where services were to be held for the year shows that name along with German Baptists. Now, I'm not sure whether the denomination or the printer included the word German, the phrase German Baptists with that. But we know from the names and locations on there that this is definitely printed for the River Brethren. The first use of the name Brethren in Christ for the River Brethren denomination, which anyone has located to date, appeared on the title page of the church's 1874 hymnal. This probably was not the Brethren's first hymnal, but it seems to be the first one bearing this designation. Printed in German, the title page indicates that it was published for the Bruder in Christo, also known as the River Bruder. Interestingly, this book has 2 sections, one in German and one with English translations of the hymn texts with an English title page. Much more can be said about this hymnal and the history of hymnody in the Brethren in Christ Church, but I'm not going to get into that this evening. For our purposes, it is sufficient to note that this is the first time the denomination's name appears in print as Brethren in Christ, 1874, almost 10 years after the Civil War. That the Brethren in Christ name was slow to come into common use is evidenced by this intriguing interview with Bishop Jacob Engel in 1879. He was one of the leaders of a group of brethren who had left this area of Pennsylvania to establish a settlement in Kansas. On their way out west, they stopped in St. Louis, and apparently a curious local reporter indulged himself by interviewing these apparently strange people. The entire article is quite lengthy, and I found it to be entertaining. Here you can see 2 excerpts that pertain to our interest. Now, from my reading of the article, it appears that the reporter was asking questions and Engel was answering them. Engel replies to one of his questions, we are what they call river brethren, said Bishop Engel, a middle-aged Granger-looking gentleman, and we come from Lancaster, Cumberland, and Franklin counties, Pennsylvania. Later on in the article, the reporter asks, may I ask you why you are called river brethren? Because the majority of the sect formerly lived along the Susquehanna River. We were also called the Old Dunkards and sometimes also Brethren in Christ. The first quotation comes from early in the article. Only later did Engel mention the Brethren in Christ name. Clearly, that Brethren in Christ name was not in prominent use in the denomination almost 15 years after the Civil War. Now, a few weeks later, The newspaper in Chambersburg copied an article from a Kansas newspaper entitled "The River Brethren." And here we see that the Brethren in Christ name figures more prominently among the group in Kansas, and it's being used first instead of River Brethren. So why did Engel call them River Brethren in St. Louis, but only a few weeks later, they're now referred to as Brethren in Christ? I suggest that this illustrates the transition from the earlier name to the current one, so the name's still in transition. By 1880, however, when the Brethren leader Henry Davidson published his History and Confession of Faith, the Brethren in Christ name was taking firm hold on the denomination. And I hate to say that Henry Davidson did not include anything about the Civil War in his history, so we don't know what he might have said. The tenacity of the River Brethren moniker was strong, continuing into the 20th century. When the Brethren in Christ incorporated under the laws of Pennsylvania in 1904, the charter document retained the language, Brethren in Christ, formerly known as the River Brethren, even though, as you can see at the bottom, they received the charter in the name Brethren in Christ. As late as 1909, the River Brethren Association was still appearing on the title page of their published minutes, and 1909 was the last year to do so. So where did the name Brethren in Christ come from? As Benjamin Castle, a Brethren man who lived in the area of Akron, Ohio, approached the age of 100, he became very reflective on his life and the history of the church. He was born in 1836 and married in 1861, so he had lived through the Civil War period. In at least 2 submissions to the church's periodical, The Evangelical Visitor, he shared his recollections of the denomination's name change. And I have bolded the sections that I think are most important. He recites pretty much what is found in either 1904 index or 1906 census. And then he says, previous to this, so previous to the Civil War, the church was known, though not ordinarily, as Brethren in Christ. Now, earlier when he had written about this name change, you see in that second selection, in parentheses, he referred to Colossians 1:2. And at the bottom there, I have it written out from the King James Version, to the saints and faithful brethren in Christ. And he says, hence the present authorized name of the church. And then he closes that paragraph by saying, traditional saying is that in the early days of the church, they greeted each other as Bruder in Christo, brother in Christ. Where else do we hear Bruder in Christo from the 1874 hymnal? If I understand Castle correctly, he was suggesting that the Brethren in Christ name was in use before the Civil War, and that it was based on the church's practice of calling each other by that designation, being a practical application of the Colossians 1:2 passage. But to some brethren, the name Brethren in Christ has no special historical significance. So much for the value of my project. And unfortunately, Mr. Hyde is not here to defend himself. He did later write a history of Crossroads Church. Yes. Because the name change has always been couched in terms of response to the Civil War draft, let's consider some historical background about that topic and how it applies to our subject. It is improper to refer to conscription during the Civil War as one single draft. And that's why I used the plural in this slide. Conscription had various phases and was rather convoluted. This evening, I will provide only the barest of overviews of the drafts with an emphasis on those aspects that would have influenced the River Brethren to change their name. Now, if you feel lost during this part of the presentation, keep in mind that the drafts were even more complex than I'm going to describing, and that the participants themselves often were confused. And I can tell you some stories about that as well. Conscription during the Civil War in the North was divided in 2 major periods. The draft from the state's militia systems in 1862, and direct conscription by the federal government from 1863 to the end of the war. We will quickly consider each period in turn. In July of 1862, to bolster the ranks of the Union Army, Congress passed the first act related to conscription. It authorized the executive branch of the U.S. government to call out troops from the state's militia systems and to conduct a draft if necessary. In early August, at the direction of the President Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton put things into motion, and Pennsylvania began enrollment for a state draft later in the month. Pennsylvania's Constitution of 1838, which was in effect at that time, provided exemption from militia service upon payment of a fee equivalent for personal service for those having conscientious scruples. And you see the sentence there in the Constitution. And by the way, something similar to this is still in the Constitution today, which is kind of interesting. The historic peace churches realized that their principles were about to be tested, and they wanted to make certain that the state government would abide by this provision. Petitions such as this one from what is now the Bermudian Church of the Brethren were sent to the governor imploring him to honor the exemption clause. And when you read the letter, you'll see that they indeed refer to the exact article and paragraph of the Constitution. Well, eventually, the state government did adhere to the Constitution, and conscientious objectors could file depositions, such as this one signed by my ancestor, Adam Stayer. So far as I know, Pennsylvania is the only state to have such a file. Now, once a man was recognized as an objector, he received a notice like the one you see here. This process did not require the registration of a particular denomination, so it is unlikely that the River Brethren changed their name during this period, which would be 1862. In fact, in a letter that's held here in the archives in Elizabethtown College is a letter from a letter to German Baptist Brethren leader Samuel R. Zug from a prominent Lancaster attorney by the name of Nathaniel Ellmaker. Ellmaker was writing about this clause in the Constitution, and this is what he says. The clause of the Constitution referred to by you takes in all of the class who conscientiously scruple to bear arms and is by no means confined to those actually belonging to religious denominations holding views of non-combatants. It is true that it will always be easier to show the alleged scruple where the person in question has a membership with a society opposed to going to war, but the oath of the party, or if need be, other testimony can be had to establish the fact. When Ellmaker died in 1898, the Lancaster newspapers noted that during the Civil War, he had, quote, appeared as counsel for the Dunkards and Mennonites to secure their exemption from the draft on account of their religious belief, unquote. So I'm assuming that he knew what he was talking about when he wrote this. Obviously, he didn't see the need for a religious group to register with the government, particularly if a drafted man didn't even need to be a member of a peace church to claim exemption for conscience. By the time the state draft was completed, more than 3,300 men had claimed the exemption. So what I'm saying is that during the state draft period, the River Brethren would not have had to register as a peace church. On March the 3rd, 1863, Congress passed the first act for a true national draft. The act established a Provost Marshal General's Bureau within the War Department to conduct the draft, which would now be directed by the federal government and not the states. Each state was divided into draft districts that corresponded to its congressional districts, as you see here. And each district was administered by an enrollment board consisting of a provost marshal with the rank of cavalry, another appointed citizen, and a surgeon or doctor. Now, because Pennsylvania was so populous, it was the second most populous state at the time of the Civil War, its draft districts were grouped into two divisions, the Eastern Division and the Western Division, with their headquarters at Philadelphia and Harrisburg, respectively. The Eastern Division consisted of the 1st through 12th districts, which is basically most of the counties east of the Susquehanna River. You can see the 12th district right here, 10th and so forth. So Lancaster County was in the Eastern Division and everything else was in the Western Division. Because Lancaster was located closer to Harrisburg, so here's Lancaster and Harrisburg's right here, but easily reachable by rail from both Philadelphia and Harrisburg, the Provost Marshal in Lancaster County often consulted with his superior in Harrisburg, even though he officially reported to the acting Assistant Provost Marshal General of Philadelphia. As you can guess, this doubles the number of places to look for pertinent records. And I have found things in the Western Division from the Provost Marshals in Lancaster County. The 1863 law had no direct exemption for conscientious objectors. However, they could provide a substitute or pay a commutation fee of $300 as provided for in Section 13 of the Act as seen here. In reality, there were a number of ways that a man could be exempted from military service. The legislation allowed for what we call hardship cases, the only son of a widow, the only son of aged or infirm parents, the father of motherless children under the age of 12, and so on. Also, once a man was drafted, the surgeon on the enrollment board could discharge him because he was physically unfit for military service. My ancestor Adam Stair was discharged in 1865 for feebleness of constitution. He died at the age of 44 in 1866, and he had a tenant farmer working his land according to the 1860 census, so he probably was quite sickly at the time. His brother David Stair was exempted from service for the loss of teeth in his upper jaw. And I found a number of cases where men were pulling their teeth out so that they could avoid the draft. Some examining surgeons seem to be more lenient than others, and many men claim various illnesses to escape military service. Medical exemptions comprise one of the largest categories of exemptions throughout the war. Now, generally, the historic peace churches balked at providing substitutes, but doing so was not unknown, as Steve has demonstrated in his book. Other than taking their chances on a medical exemption, the preferred exemption among Brethren and Mennonites was paying the commutation fee. In 1863, the commutation payment was available to all draftees, not just members of the peace churches, so one did not need to be a member of such a church to take advantage of it. Therefore, the River Brethren would not have had to require to be registered as a peace church in 1863 to take advantage of this opportunity. Now, problems with the conscription process soon became evident, and towards the end of 1863 and the beginning of 1864, Congress discussed amendments to the Draft Act. One particular concern was the wide availability of paying commutation to escape the draft, and it was reducing the numbers of men taking this service. As Congress was debating this, the peace churches petitioned the federal government to retain the commutation fee in any new legislation. In January 1864, a River Brethren minister named Jacob S. Engel wrote to Thaddeus Stevens to express the fears of his church. He says, "Dear sir, I wish to embrace the present opportunity to inform you that we have been informed that the computation law is about being repealed, which concerns us as a non-resisting body. If such be the case, place us in a very difficult position, as we cannot conscientiously furnish a substitute or personally serve in military service. And we wish you, as the representative of our county, to present our case, and if necessary, give us advice, if you please, how to proceed in behalf of our church. Please drop a few lines soon." Even though he doesn't state as such, we know from his obituary that Jacob S. Engel was a Reverend Brethren minister. Engel's letter was sent to Thaddeus Stevens with a cover letter by prominent Marietta merchant and banker Bar Spangler. And Bar Spangler wrote this: "The enclosed letter from Reverend Jacob S. Engel has been written by instruction of the religious societies known as Dunkers of this county and Cumberland, they having assigned him the duty of communicating with you on the subject. If you think it important that they should remonstrate against the repeal of the commutation, I will write them a remonstrance and let them circulate it for signatures. It will be very pleasing to them to hear from you on the subject. And as your chirography would be all Latin to them, allow me to suggest that our friend William Child Esquire write them under your dictation, as they will want to pass a letter around for general perusal." Chirography is handwriting, and I can attest to the fact that Thaddeus Stevens has probably the worst handwriting I've ever seen in any historical document. Just several thoughts here. Engel did not identify the denomination which he was associated, and Spangler only noted that they were Dunkers. If the River Brethren had accepted the Brethren in Christ's name by this time, one would think that Engel might have referred to himself that way, or that Spangler may have been more specific in his statement. This letter provides evidence that the name change did not occur prior to 1864, particularly since Engel was writing right from this area, right from the heart of River Brethren country. On February 24th, 1864, Congress passed an amendment to the 1863 Conscription Act. This legislation severely restricted commutation, but thanks to Thaddeus Stevens, provisions were retained for conscientious objectors. Under the amendment, those claiming exemption for conscientious scruples had to take an oath or make affirmation that they were opposed to bearing arms, and they had to provide evidence of their convictions. They then could perform non-combatant service or pay the $300 commutation fee. Other draftees also could pay the commutation fee, but it was only good for 1 year. So how did all of this work? George Eister, who was provost marshal of the 16th District of Pennsylvania, he was a very harsh critic of exemptions for conscientious scruples, described the process that he followed which was probably typical of other marshals as well. He says, the law of Congress provides that members of religious denominations who shall by oath or affirmation declare that they are conscientiously opposed to bearing of arms, and who are prohibited from doing so by the rules and articles of faith and practice of said religious denomination, shall, when drafted into the military service, be considered non-combatants. Please observe that to be entitled to the benefit of the act, a man must both be a member of a denomination and the rules and articles of faith and practice of that denomination must prohibit him from bearing arms. Our practice has been in every case to hold the party to strict proof within the meaning of the law he is entitled to pay commutation. So you see that Eyster wanted some definite proof that the person had true peace principles and that they were a member of a denomination. In spite of his negative view of objectors, Eyster accepted the documentation of 37 objectors in 1 week. So his superiors investigated his supposed leniency. They were a little concerned about that. So they sent this inspection officer out to check on him. And this is what he observed about what was required to establish a man's peace principles. The forms of proof offered upon these exemptions were granted. In each case, the party made oath that he was conscientiously opposed to the bearing of arms, stated of what denomination he was a member, and that he was prohibited from doing so by the rules and articles of faith and practice of said religious denominations, to which was added the certificate under oath of 2 persons who were personally acquainted with him, and that his deportment has been uniformly consistent with such declarations. Juniata College has a document from a Montgomery County German Baptist that shows at least part of what was being Eyster was talking about here. I think you can read that without me reading it to you. So this would have been part of it was filed, required by Eyster to verify somebody's peace principles. In July of 1864, Congress further amended the conscription law to limit the payment of a commutation fee only to objectors. This action significantly reduced the numbers of men paying the fee. From that point on to the end of the war, the records usually noted that a person paying the commutation fee for reasons of conscience was a non-combatant, as we see here. So you can see that it says they paid the commutation, and then it says non-combatant. I think this number is the number of the certificate or proof that they may have given to the individual. I haven't really checked into that. A chart in James Geary's masterful work on the Union draft demonstrates the effect that the constrictions on the availability of commutation had on the numbers of men claiming such an exemption. So you can see here, particularly at December of 1864, there were only 460 men, this is for the whole country, who paid commutation. Now, some individuals were permitted to pay commutation after the July Act because they had been promised to do so before February 24th of 1864, but had not done so. But you can assume pretty much that most, particularly in December of 1864, that most of these men were conscientious objectors, there's 460. If River Brethren went on record as a peace church with the federal government during the Civil War, it probably was in response to the February and July 1864 legislation and its implementation. They might have been concerned that the provost marshals would not accept the documentation from their church because of its tiny size. Although unsupported, Peter Brock's statement that the extreme congregationalism of the Brethren contributed to their desire to be recognized as a legitimate denomination may be partially correct in this instance. We don't know, but I would, if I had to place a name change, it would have occurred at least during this year. I would like to conclude this evening's presentation with some considerations and questions for further research. Based on all that we have reviewed, we can say with some certainty that the River Brethren probably changed their name no earlier than 1864, if it was done in response to the Civil War drafts. Most likely the change occurred after February 24th, 1864, when the federal government began to require documentation from conscientious objectors of their church membership and peace principles. Now, as you have seen, much of my work has focused on Lancaster County, primarily because the 20th century accounts of the name change story place an important meeting of the Brethren in Lancaster. So I was asking myself the question, why was the council held in Lancaster? Well, first of all, the largest group of River Brethren was found in this county, and some of its most prominent leaders were living here in Lancaster County, like Bishop Jacob Gish and Bishop Jacob Hostetter, John Gish and Jacob Hostetter. Also, if the name change was in response to some draft situation, it's possible that the men who were drafted had been in Lancaster County. However, I'm a little less certain of this now because both myself and Steve's co-author, Jim Lehman, have spent a lot of time going through the Lancaster County draft records and have found no evidence that River Brethren had any special situations going on. Given Provost Marshal George Eister's dislike of religious objectors, it is possible that the brethren who lived in Franklin County, which is a part of his district, felt undue pressure from him, which resulted in the document I am seeking. The Cumberland Valley Railroad provided easy access to Harrisburg and thus to Lancaster, so traveling to Lancaster from that area would not have been a problem. On the other hand, if the brethren in Franklin County were the source of the name change story, I would have thought that Edsel Burge, in his doorstop of a book, no, this is a good book, would have encountered documentation when he wrote his History of the Mennonites in Franklin County. He has some very interesting things in here about the Mennonites' experience of the draft. Speaking of rail travel, another reason the council may have convened in Lancaster was that the city was easily accessible by railroads from Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and Columbia. Most of the Pennsylvania Brethren would have had been able to travel to Lancaster with little difficulty. Now, as suggested earlier, the influence of Pennsylvania's powerful Congressman Thaddeus Stevens should not be overlooked. Throughout the Civil War, he kept the concerns of his Peace Church constituents in mind, as we have seen. The Brethren may have convened in Lancaster County because they intended to send their communication to Washington through their valuable contact, Congressman Stevens. His papers are scattered and incomplete, so it is quite possible that a letter from the Brethren that was sent to him has not survived or has not yet been located. But he was not the only member of the Stevens family who may have influenced the decision of the Brethren to have their meeting here in Lancaster County. Shortly after the amendment to the draft law in February of 1864, he was instrumental in getting his nephew, his namesake Thaddeus Stevens Jr., appointed as Provost Marshal of Pennsylvania's 9th District, which was Lancaster County. And this action may have contributed to the Brethren's belief that they could get a sympathetic hearing in this area. Now, I've been hoping that this connection with the Stevens family might result in documentation name change, but the direction of this research has not been fruitful to date. Now, as you may have deduced from my presentation, I've been checking a variety of church sources, newspapers, local historical materials, and draft records. So where else to look? Because of the close association between the adoption of the Brethren in Christ's name and the Civil War draft in the North, the draft records at the National Archives seem to be the most logical place to continue searching for pertinent documentation. The draft records are found in Record Group 110, Records of the Provost Marshal General's Bureau at the National Archives. And they can be grouped into three categories. Those are the local districts and local provost marshals, such as Thaddeus Stevens Jr. here in Lancaster County, and then records of the divisions that I talked about earlier, and also at the third level, top level, the records of the main office in Washington, D.C. The local records are arranged numerically by draft district, as you see here, and I have been going through those systematically for the districts that would contain River Brethren congregations. The district records can be quite voluminous. This is only the first 2 pages of a 9-page listing of just the records for the 9th district. As I mentioned earlier, because of its size, Pennsylvania is divided into 2 divisions that supervised the work of the provost marshals. The top official in each division was called an acting assistant provost marshal general, serving as an intermediary between the local marshals and the main office in Washington, D.C. Therefore, their records must be checked as well because some matters were sent directly to them, particularly if the parties felt the local marshal was not responsive to their concerns. And I have found some evidence of this. The records at the division level are just as massive, if not more so, than those at the local level. And here you can see an overview of the division records and then 2 pages of a breakdown of those records. The district and division records for Pennsylvania are located in National Archives branch in Philadelphia, which is situated only about a mile south of the Bensalem Exeter Turnpike, making it much more accessible than the facility in Washington, D.C. If, however, I have to go to Washington, I may need to look at the records of the main office of the Provost Marshal General's headquarters. I've been trying to avoid this because these files are even larger than the local and divisional ones, and they're not well indexed. And the problem with most of the indexes is they're indexed by name, but you're looking for a topic. So I keep a list of River Brethren names I take with me and look for all those names, but we don't know that those names are going to be in the index because the document we may be seeking might have been sent from a Provost Marshal to the Provost Marshal General Washington, and it would be under their name. Many of these records are arranged chronologically, and so if I had an exact date or an approximate date, my task would be much simpler, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm hoping that the records here in Pennsylvania will give me a more specific date of when they might have communicated with Washington, D.C. To track my progress, I've developed a spreadsheet like you see here with data regarding the series to be checked and the results of my investigations, and I update it after each trip to the National Archives. Historian James Geary expressed how I feel about these records. There remains much to be gleaned about American society in the 1860s from the data in Record Group 110. Despite my work in these sources, I have only scratched the surface, and despite the difficulties I encountered, others should not be deterred from pursuing research projects based on these materials. Above all, it is imperative to have a general research plan in place and to do as much preliminary research as possible before visiting the National Archives. And that's a lot of what I've been doing here at the Young Center is the preliminary research. At least initially, any new study should have a much narrower focus than what I began with, because the frustrations of this long, drawn-out endeavor often led me to wonder whether it was worth doing. Only now I can say that it was. The possibility remains that the Brethren petitioned directly to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and never navigated the draft bureaucracy. If so, I will need to check the records of his office, but again, having an exact date would make my job a lot easier. I shudder to think that I might need to scour those records with the limited information I now have. But as historian Geary again wrote, this experience merely reaffirms the maxim that a researcher in 19th century records can never assume that a source does not exist simply because it's not where it's supposed to be. And let me just say, a couple months ago, I had a conversation with Morris Sider, who said that I thought that document was unfindable. And I never believe there is such a thing as a brick wall in historical or genealogical research. As one of the members of my church says at the end of a Sunday school lesson, so what? Why does any of this matter? Why is it important? Well, what's the importance of what we have just learned? Well, my study is particularly relevant to the Brethren in Christ Church in the United States because it has been considering another name change for more than a decade. And here you see a copy of their minutes from 2020. The denomination decided to retain its current name, but I'm certain that the issue will not go away. Understanding the historical context of its current name will enable the Brethren to make a more informed decision about abandoning it and adopting a new one. In fact, the Canadian Conference of the Brethren in Christ has already changed its name to Be in Christ a number of years ago. My project is also significant for Civil War studies because to date, no student of the draft has uncovered evidence that a religious body was required to register as a peace church during the war, or that such a group changed its name in response to the conscription laws. If records can be unearthed to verify that the River Brethren exited the war as a Brethren in Christ, owing to the draft, a new first will be added to the already vast field of Civil War historical studies. Additionally, such documentation will expand our knowledge of the operation of the draft and of how a tiny religious minority interacted with a large, powerful federal government. Many of the facts surrounding the adoption of the name Brethren in Christ by the River Brethren still remain obscure or unknown. The pearl of great price is yet to be found. Tell it not to Gath. Thank you for your time and attention this evening. I've greatly enjoyed my time as a Kreider Fellow and the opportunity to share my findings with you. I will be glad to take questions, comments, suggestions, or even criticisms at this time. So if you have any suggestions, I'd be glad to hear them. Thank you. Yes,
Talking about you had to be a peace church. Brethren, wasn't River Brethren known as Peace Church?
yes. If I did not make that clear, I apologize. They were consistently known as a peace church. I would say less consistently today. I know some brethren in Christ who would not necessarily hold to that position. But particularly in the 19th century, yes, they were known as part of one of the peace churches. Yes. Any other questions? Anybody know where the Mount Joy Herald is located? I called the Mount Joy Historical Society, and they said they weren't aware of any issues that are extant, but I do know that there's one at the Lancaster County Historical Society. So, anybody else? Yes.
I'll bite for your earlier comment that you have stories about searching for lost University of Potomac records. I'm just curious about that.
Well, when I first found that reference, I thought if I can find Asa Climenhage's dissertation, there might be things in dissertation that did not make it into the book that might provide background. So I did a Google search on Potomac University, and the first thing that came up was University of Potomac, which I later found out is a for-profit college. So I called and asked to speak to the librarian. Well, it's one of these places I don't think has a real library, and they never did get back to me. And it was actually found that the University of the Potomac was founded, I think in 1970s or 1980s, so it was not that Potomac University. So I did some more Google searching, and I found out that the previous name of, I think, was it a Church of God or Church of Christ institution, had a seminary by the name of Potomac, or it might have been Potomac Seminary, Potomac University. So, well, maybe that's it. But when I contacted them, they said, no, our predecessor, Potomac University, or whatever it was only established, I think in like 1925 or later, so it could not have been the one that Climenhage got his degree from. And then as part of the wonderful blessing of being a Kreider Fellow, I was able to subscribe to newspapers.com. I did a search through newspapers.com on Potomac University between 1920 and 1930. And lo and behold, I hit a whole bunch of references in the Washington, D.C. newspapers about Congress's investigation of this place called Potomac University and how these ministers, like there was a Baptist minister from New York State, and other ministers were coming to appear before Congress and saying, oh, this was a wonderful thing, and yes, it was valuable, but the reason they were investigating Potomac University because they said it was a diploma mill and it was not really had a strong academic background. And so I'm not sure the level of academic credibility that Climenhage's first doctorate had. However, he did later get a doctorate from, was it Cornell? I think he got a later, so I mean, obviously he had the academic ability to do that. But my main interest was trying to find the records of this institution to see if I could get a copy. In fact, I went to you can go to a database online look for dissertations, and it was not in there. And I contacted, I think I even contacted Clarissa Brunwald here at the Interlibrary Loan. I think she did a search too and said, just, you're way out of your league here. This isn't what you want. And so it was quite an interesting thing, particularly when I was talking to the people at the for-profit university on the phone, and they like had no idea what a library was or if dissertation, what the dissertation was or anything like that. So just to let you know, doing research like this is just one of my favorite things to do. So I was always telling my wife and family, I'm getting somewhat paid, but to do what I really love to do is go dig up things. I've spent many hours up at the Brother in Christ archives going through those papers, which I highly recommend. In case you're interested, I brought along my grandfather's college picture from Elizabethtown College in 1920. He's the last person to the right on this picture. So this was taken in front of Alpha Hall. I've spent some time up around Alpha Hall trying to figure exactly where they were standing when they took that picture. So. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to all of you here this evening for coming out this evening, and those of you who joined us online. Special thanks this evening to our support staff from Information Technology Services who made this program possible, and thanks to Elizabethtown College for its support of the Young Center. Have a good evening and safe travels home, and before you leave, please join us for some refreshments in the lobby. Thank you.